Ask any watch collector to name the most famous space watch ever made, and they will almost certainly say the Omega Speedmaster, the Moonwatch. The one Buzz Aldrin wore when he stepped onto the lunar surface in 1969. Omega has spent decades marketing that story. It is on billboards, in magazine spreads, plastered across the walls of every authorized dealer on the planet. But here is what almost nobody mentions. 8 years before that moonwalk, before NASA had even started testing chronographs for space missions, a 27-year-old Soviet pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed into a capsule the size of a phone booth, launched from the Kazakh steppe, and orbited the entire Earth. And on his wrist, sewn right onto the sleeve of his spacesuit, was a watch. Not an Omega, not a Rolex, a Sturmanskie. A 33mm military-issue navigator's watch, built by a Moscow factory that, just 3 decades earlier, did not even exist. That watch became the first timepiece to ever leave the atmosphere. It beat the Omega to space by 8 full years. And almost nobody outside of watch-collecting circles or former Soviet states has ever heard of it. Its story starts in the strangest place imaginable for a piece of Soviet technology. It starts in Canton, Ohio. In 1927, the Soviet Union had a problem. The country could not make watches. Not a single factory in the entire nation produced a functioning timepiece. Every watch worn by a Soviet citizen, every clock on a Soviet wall, was imported, and imports cost gold, which the government badly needed for industrialization. So on December 21, 1927, the Council of Labor and Defense passed a resolution with a straightforward title about how to organize watch production in the USSR. The goal was equally straightforward: build watches that could compete with Switzerland and America. The trouble was, they had no idea how. Stalin's first 5-year plan had just launched. The entire Soviet economy was being reorganized from the ground up, and watchmaking was near the top of the priority list. But you cannot build an industry from nothing. You need machines, you need expertise, you need people who have done this before. And in 1928, none of those things existed inside Soviet borders, so they went shopping. Through a trading company called Amtorg, the Soviet government's commercial arm in the United States, a small team of engineers was sent abroad to scout for options. They found what they needed in 2 bankrupt American companies. One was the Ansonia Clock Company out of Brooklyn, New York. The other was the Duber Hamden Watch Company, based in Canton, Ohio. Both companies had been crushed by the Great Depression. Their technology was outdated by American standards. Their finances were ruined, and their debt holders wanted any buyer who could pay cash. The Soviets were happy to oblige. On April 26, 1929, 2 contracts were signed. The first was for factory equipment at $325,000. The second was for spare parts and unfinished timepieces at another $125,000. Within months, Soviet specialists traveled to Canton and began packing up the entire operation. Every lathe, every press, every engraving tool, every box of spare gears, 28 freight cars worth of machinery and parts, all of it headed for Moscow. But the machines alone were useless without the people who knew how to run them. So the Soviets made the American workers an offer. 23 former Duber Hamden employees, watchmakers and engravers and technicians who had lost their jobs when the company folded, signed 1-year contracts to travel to Moscow and train the Russian workforce from scratch. In February of 1930, those 23 Americans left Ohio behind and boarded a ship for the Soviet Union. Think about that for a second. The height of the Depression. Jobs were disappearing everywhere, and a group of Ohio watchmakers said yes to Joseph Stalin because they needed the paycheck. Construction on the new factory began that same month, built on the site of a former tobacco factory in Moscow. It was classified as a top priority project. By June of 1930, the building was finished. By September, the primary equipment was installed, and on October 1st, 1930, a day the factory would later call the Day of the Hammer, the first state watch factory officially started production. The American technicians spent that first year training their Soviet counterparts from the ground up, everything from setting jewels to calibrating balance wheels. The conditions were not exactly luxurious. Moscow, in the early 30s, was a city still defining itself. The Americans had come for the paycheck, not the politics, and most went home when their contracts expired. A few stayed longer. At least one never made it home at all. The earliest watches that rolled off the line still had movements stamped with the words Duba Hamden, Canton, Ohio, USA. Collectors today consider those dual heritage pieces among the most fascinating artifacts in horology. American bones, Soviet skin. Within a decade, that single factory was producing nearly 3 million watches a year. Pocket watches, wristwatches, cockpit instruments, and stopwatches, all flowing out of a building that had not existed 5 years earlier. Then the war came. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht was closing in on Moscow, and the entire factory had to be evacuated. Every piece of equipment, all 1,260 items, was loaded onto trains and shipped over 1,600 kilometers east to the city of Zlatoust, along with 296 of the factory's watchmakers and technicians. In its new mountain location, the plant was redesignated Factory 845. During the war years, it shifted production to military instruments and munitions. Watches would have to wait. By 1943, the tide had turned. The Germans were in retreat, and the factory moved back to Moscow. It was reorganized under a new name, the First Moscow Watch Factory. The evacuation had cost time, but it had also proved something. The entire Soviet watchmaking industry, built from scratch in 1930, had survived a world war. The machines still worked, the knowledge had not been lost, and the ambition had only gotten sharper. In 1946, the factory released a watch called the Pobeda, which means victory in Russian. Its name and design were personally approved by Stalin. The Pobeda became one of the most widely produced timepieces in Soviet history. But the factory's engineers had something more specialized in mind. In 1949, 3 years after the Pobeda launch, they introduced a new line of watches built specifically for military pilots and navigators. The name they chose was Sturmanskie, derived from the Russian word for navigator. And unlike the Pobeda, you could not walk into a store and buy one. The Sturmanskie was issued exclusively to graduates of Soviet Air Force academies. It was not a consumer product, it was a tool, and the military treated it that way. The first version, known among collectors today as the Type 1, used a 15 jewel movement based on a French caliber originally designed by a company called LIP. It featured a 33mm chrome-plated brass case, blued steel hands, a distinctive red seconds hand with a clover leaf tip, and radium-painted numerals so pilots could read the time in darkened cockpits. The dial carried the name Sturmanskie in Cyrillic script arched in a rainbow pattern beneath the 12 o'clock position, and the Soviet Air Force logo sat just above the 6. It had a hacking function, which meant the seconds hand stopped when you pulled the crown, allowing precise time synchronization during formation flights and bombing runs. You could not buy one in any store. You could not order one through the Voentorg, the military supply shops where officers purchased their uniforms and personal gear. The only way to get a Sturmanskie was to graduate from a Soviet Air Force academy. For a young military pilot in the early 1950s, receiving one was both a practical necessity and a genuine mark of achievement. It meant you had made it, but the Type 1 had limitations. No shock protection, no water resistance, a snap-on case back that let in dust. It was functional, but barely durable enough for the conditions Soviet pilots actually faced. So in 1954, the factory upgraded. The Sturmanskie Type 2 kept the same basic design language but improved nearly everything underneath. The movement was now a 17 dual caliber 43M, based on the Soviet 2609, with manual winding, a hacking seconds complication, and proper shock protection on the balance wheel. The caseback was now screw down. The movement was decorated with polished Geneva stripes and bore inscriptions confirming its 17 rubies and its manufacture by the first Moscow watch factory. It carried a power reserve of about 34 hours and a daily accuracy tolerance of plus or minus 30 seconds. It was still only 33 millimeters across, still purely military issue, still unavailable to the public. But it was a legitimate precision instrument, and it was this exact watch, the Type II, that ended up on the wrist of a young pilot named Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin. Gagarin was born in 1934 in a small village west of Moscow. His father was a carpenter. His mother worked on a collective farm. As a teenager, he developed an interest in aviation and enrolled in a flying club in Saratov, eventually working his way into the Orenburg Military Pilot School. In 1957, Gagarin graduated with honors, and like every Soviet Air Force graduate of that era, he was issued a Sturmanskie watch. His specific watch was a Type II, dated to that year. 2 years after graduation, everything changed. In 1959, the Soviet space program put out a call for cosmonaut candidates. Gagarin volunteered. He was one of 3,500 applicants. The selection process was brutal. Months of physical endurance tests, psychological evaluations, centrifuge training that pressed candidates into their seats at forces that turned vision gray, prolonged isolation chambers designed to see who cracked under silence. The program needed someone who could sit inside a sealed metal sphere hurtling through the void and stay composed. Gagarin made the cut, and not just any cut. He was chosen as the primary pilot for the first ever crewed spaceflight. The reasons were partly physical. He was compact, about 5 feet 2 inches tall, which mattered in a capsule as cramped as the Vostok 1, where even an average-sized man would have struggled to fit alongside the instruments. But his temperament played an even bigger role. He was calm under pressure, quick to smile, and genuinely well-liked by almost everyone around him. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of the Soviet space program, reportedly favored Gagarin in part because of his working-class background, the son of a carpenter representing the workers' state. It made for a good story, and, in the space race, story mattered almost as much as engineering. On the morning of April 12, 1961, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, Gagarin suited up and climbed into the Vostok 1 spacecraft. His Sturmanskie was attached to the outside of his spacesuit sleeve, positioned so he could read it at a glance during the flight. The choice was likely not accidental. The cosmonaut training team would have approved the watch as part of his equipment, and Gagarin had already spent 4 years relying on his Sturmanskie during flight training. He knew the watch. He trusted it. At 9:07 Moscow time, the Vostok 1 rocket fired. Gagarin reportedly said "Poyakali," a casual Russian phrase that roughly translates to "off we go." The rocket accelerated through the atmosphere, pressing Gagarin into his seat at forces that would render most people unconscious. Within minutes, the capsule separated from the booster and reached orbit at an altitude of 328 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Below him, the planet he had never seen from above stretched out in a curve he could trace with his eyes. He later described the Earth as having a beautiful blue halo, and said the transition from light blue to dark blue to the complete blackness of space was one of the most striking things he had ever witnessed. For the next 108 minutes, Yuri Gagarin circled the planet. He experienced sustained weightlessness for the first time in human history. He watched the sun set and rise again while traveling at nearly 28,000 kilometers per hour. And through all of it, the Sturmanskie on his wrist kept ticking. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Nobody had ever tested a mechanical watch in actual spaceflight before. The conditions were extreme. The launch subjected Gagarin's body to forces of up to 8G. Then came sustained weightlessness, which affects the movement of mechanical components in ways that had never been studied outside a laboratory. And then re-entry, with its own violent deceleration. The Sturmanskie survived all of it without missing a beat. The watch came back to Earth running perfectly. Gagarin landed in the Saratov region near the town of Engels at 10:55 Moscow time. The first person to reach him was a military officer named Ahmed Gassiev, who later recalled helping Gagarin out of his suit. 2 days later, On April 14th, the newspaper Pravda published an interview with the newly famous cosmonaut. One of the reporters asked him a simple question. "By the way, what did you use to monitor the time?" Gagarin smiled, rolled up his jacket sleeve, and showed the interviewer his watch. "This very earthly watch," he said, presenting an ordinary navigator's timepiece produced by the first Moscow watch factory. When asked how the watch had held up in space, his answer was 3 words: "Still as true as new." That moment, captured in print and repeated in Soviet media for years afterward, cemented the Sturmanskie as the first watch in space, not by marketing, not by a corporate sponsorship deal, by the simple fact that a pilot trusted it enough to bring it along on the most dangerous journey any human had ever attempted. But what happened to the actual watch is its own story, and it gets a little tangled. After returning from his flight, Gagarin became close with Air Force Marshal Konstantin Vershinin, the man who had signed off on his candidacy for the cosmonaut program and helped oversee the Vostok 1 launch alongside chief designer Sergei Korolev. At some point in the days or weeks following the flight, Gagarin gave Vershinin his watch, the one he had worn in space. It was apparently a gesture of gratitude, the kind of personal exchange that happened often between Soviet military officers but rarely got documented in official records. After Vershinin's death, his daughter Yelena inherited the watch and eventually donated it to the museum at the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center, which is located at Star City, about 50 kilometers east of Moscow. It is still there today. Anyone who visits the museum can see it behind glass. A modest 33mm timepiece with a black dial and Cyrillic lettering, sitting quietly among spacesuits and capsule mock-ups that get far more attention. Here is where the story gets interesting for watch collectors. In December of 1993, Sotheby's in New York held a space exploration auction. Lot 17 was described as the watch Yuri Gagarin wore during the Vostok 1 mission. It sold for $25,875. There was just one problem. It was not a Sturmanskie. It was a Rodina, a completely different model also made by the first Moscow watch factory, but clearly not a military navigator's watch. The accompanying documentation described it as a gift to Yuri Gagarin from the commander of the Air Force, Marshal Vershinin, in honor of the memorable flight. Read that carefully. It was a gift to Gagarin from Vershinin, given after the flight, not the watch he actually wore during it. Somewhere between the consignment and the catalog copy, the story got scrambled. The Sotheby's listing got it wrong, and the error has echoed through watch collecting circles for decades. To this day, you can find articles and forum threads where people cite the Rodina auction as proof that the Sturmanskie story is a myth. It is not. The Rodina was Gagarin's personal dress watch, a gift he likely treasured, but it never left the atmosphere. Meanwhile, the factory that built the real space watch was undergoing its own transformation. In 1961, the same year as Gagarin's flight, the first Moscow watch factory was renamed Poljot, which is the Russian word for flight. The name change was a direct tribute to the Vostok mission. Under the Poljot brand, the factory continued producing watches for Soviet cosmonauts and military personnel. At its peak, it was manufacturing around 500,000 watches a year, including 60,000 chronographs. And the space connection did not end with Gagarin. On March 18, 1965, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov floated out of his Vostok 2 spacecraft and became the first human being to walk in open space. The spacewalk lasted 12 minutes and 9 seconds, and it nearly killed him. Once outside the capsule, connected only by a tether 5 1/3 meters long, Leonov's suit began to inflate in the vacuum. The pressure differential caused the suit to balloon outward until his hands pulled away from the gloves and his feet lifted out of the boots. He could barely move. When it came time to re-enter the airlock, Leonov could not fit. He made a decision that the mission planners had never trained for. He manually vented pressure from his own suit, reducing it to dangerous levels, and forced himself back through the opening. He later described the extraordinary silence of space and the sound of his own heartbeat as the loudest things he could hear. Through it all, he was wearing a Strela chronograph on his wrist, another watch built by the same first Moscow watch factory that produced the Sturmanskie. That made the Strela the first watch exposed to the actual vacuum of space, not just orbit inside a sealed capsule. And Leonov's spacewalk happened 3 months before American astronaut Edward White performed NASA's first spacewalk wearing an Omega Speedmaster. Speaking of the Speedmaster, here is the timeline that rarely gets told in full. In 1962, astronaut Wally Schirra personally wore his own Omega Speedmaster on the Mercury Atlas 8 mission, making it the first Omega in space. In 1964, NASA began formally testing chronographs for its upcoming Gemini program. They sent identical requests to Omega, Rolex, and Longines Wittnauer. The watches were subjected to extreme temperature swings, vacuum exposure, shock, vibration, and high acceleration up to 12 G. Only the Omega Speedmaster passed every test. By 1965, NASA had officially certified it for all crewed missions. It went on to reach the moon, and Omega never let the world forget it. The marketing machine behind the Moonwatch is one of the most effective campaigns in the history of luxury goods. The Sturmanskie had no such campaign. There was no Madison Avenue agency working on Soviet watch marketing. There were no glossy magazine ads, no celebrity endorsements, no authorized dealers in London or New York or Tokyo. The Soviet Union did not market watches to Western consumers because it had no interest in doing so. Watches were tools, not luxury goods. They existed to keep pilots on schedule and soldiers coordinated, not to appear on someone's wrist at a cocktail party. For over 3 decades, the Sturmanskie was not even available to Soviet civilians. It remained a military issue item until 1983, when it was finally released for public sale inside the Soviet Union. By then, the brand name had almost zero international recognition, and the geopolitics of the Cold War meant that even the basic facts of Soviet space achievements were filtered, downplayed, or simply unknown in the West. Gagarin was a household name in the Eastern Bloc. In America, he was a footnote, his watch even less. The decline of the Poljot factory followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. After 1991, the factory was privatized and restructured, but the transition from a state-run enterprise to a competitive business in the global watch market was brutal. Financial mismanagement piled up. Quality standards slipped as experienced watchmakers retired or left for better-paying jobs. Equipment that had been world-class in the 1960s was now decades behind Swiss and Japanese competitors. By the early 2000s, Poljot was heading toward bankruptcy, and the brand name ended up in the hands of outside investors who had little connection to the factory floor. But a group of former employees, people who had actually built the watches, refused to let the story end there. In the year 2000, they founded a company called Volmax, based partly in Moscow and partly in Switzerland. In 2002, Volmax acquired the Sturmanskie trademark and began producing watches under the original brand name, using designs and movements that trace their lineage directly back to the Gagarin era. They launched the Gagarin Heritage Collection, a line of watches modeled closely after the original Type II, 40mm case. Classic black dial with the same sword-shaped hands and index markers. Phosphorus-based lume replacing the original radium. Many models still use the manual winding Poljot 2609 caliber, the same movement family that powered the watch on Vostok 1. The casebacks carry an engraved portrait of Gagarin. It is not a replica in the strictest sense, but it is about as close as modern manufacturing and modern safety regulations will allow. Today, the Sturmanskie occupies a strange position in the watch world. Among collectors who know Soviet horology, it is deeply respected. An original Type II from the 1950s in good condition is a serious find, and authentic examples are extremely rare because production runs were small and the watches were military issue, meaning most were returned to the government when a pilot's service ended. The few that survived are heavily sought after, though even experts warn that the market is full of fakes and Franken watches cobbled together from mismatched parts. For the broader public, though, the Sturmanskie remains almost unknown. Ask a random person on the street, what watch went to space first, and they will say Omega. Not because Omega was first, but because Omega told the story louder and more often. The Sturmanskies' achievement is documented, verified, and sitting in a glass case at the Cosmonaut Training Center. Gagarin confirmed it himself, on the record, 2 days after he landed. But history belongs to whoever tells it best, and the Soviet Union was never in the business of selling wristwatches to the West. What sits in that museum case is not just a watch, it is a 33mm argument that the space race was more complicated than the version we grew up with. A story that starts with 23 unemployed Ohio watchmakers boarding a ship to Moscow in the dead of winter, training people they had never met to do a job their own country no longer valued. That runs through Stalin's 5-year plans and a factory evacuated just ahead of Nazi tanks. Through a watch line built for pilots who would never see it in stores, and a young man from a village of carpenters who beat 3,500 other candidates for a seat in a capsule the size of a closet. Through 108 minutes that changed what human beings believed was possible, the Omega Speedmaster went to the moon. That is true, and it is an extraordinary achievement. But the Sturmanskie went to space first. And for a watch that nobody was trying to sell, that had no marketing budget and no celebrity campaign and no boutique on Fifth Avenue, it has done a remarkable job of refusing to be forgotten. If you found this story worth your time, hit the subscribe button and leave a comment with the watch you would have taken to space. And if this showed up in your feed without a like on it yet, fix that on your way out.